Hello and welcome to Chapmanomics with me, Mr. Chapman. In this lesson, we're going to carry on looking at growth and development and the factors that influence growth and development in particular. And we're going to start off by looking at our first factor, which is primary product dependency. If you've not seen the previous videos in this series, please do go back and watch them. They're going to give you the base understanding that you'll need and also take you through the case study of Zambia that we are going to be using in this video. Without further ado, let's jump into it. So primary product dependency is something that we saw a little bit of in the last video, but we're going to look a bit more at the theory of it right now and see exactly why it constrains economic growth. So primary product dependency is a situation in which an economy is reliant for its economic growth and its economic development in the production and export of one or more primary products. Now, primary products, if you remember, are goods and services goods that you dig out the ground. There's not many services you dig out the ground. Goods that you dig out the ground. So it's anything that comes directly from the land. Our secondary industries are where we manufacture stuff. Tertiary industries are services, and then there is the quaternary industry, which is information gathering and dissemination. And here with Zambia, Zambia is primary product dependent. So in answer to our first question, yes, Zambia is primary product dependent. It is dependent on copper. And how we know that is because 64% of exports and 1/5 of the economy is copper. That is a huge amount for one country to be relying on as a single export. And this idea of being primary product dependent, we often think of it as being a really bad thing, and it's not usually that great in the long term. But actually, if we look at Zambia, its primary product dependency has helped it grow economically. So in particularly rural areas here have seen growth. If you think back to our case study that we looked at last time, we saw that when there was a boom in Zambia, and in copper in particular in Zambia, that Zambia was selling, there was a real benefit to those urban areas. So, sorry, not rural areas here, goodness me, I'm all over the shop in this lesson. In our urban areas. So urban areas have been able to grow economically because of the boom in commodity prices. So when prices of our primary products are very, very high, it's not usually that big a problem to be primary product dependent because you're gaining a lot of income. They're very easy usually to produce. You just need a mine in this case and some people to man the mine. And they're quite easy usually to export because lots of countries need primary products in order to manufacture with them. And so when there is a boom in those prices, it is a good thing for a country to be primary product dependent, or it can be, provided that they then use that money to help grow and develop other sections of the economy. So for Zambia, then being primary product dependent has helped them kind of get going. It's almost given them something to export and produce, so to produce and export. And this is a good thing because it means you can get the economy started. And the idea being that you can then use the money that you gain from being primary product dependent and the boom times to then invest for the times when primary products start to fall in price. So has primary product dependency helped Zambia grow in terms of their development? Well, sort of. So although it has kind of helped again in urban areas, they have developed a bit. Primary product dependency hasn't really helped massively. There's lots of poverty in the country. And again, when there's these bust times, really there's not much government, not much tax revenue for the government. Not enough tax. For the government, meaning that governments had to borrow a huge amount of money in order to fund anything development-wise. So there's kind of two sides to the coin to being primary product dependent. One is that if you use the money you gain from being primary product dependent, then reinvest back into the economy, grow the economy and develop the economy, then it's not so bad. But if you don't do that, if you just take the boom times and you import a bunch of stuff, in order to make the richest in your economy feel better, then it's not so good. Let's have a look then at the theory of primary product dependency to explain how it impacts on economic growth. Now, I'm going to go through these in a very shallow level of depth on the whiteboard here, but I would like you to go through them by doing at least 4 chains of reasoning to explain how primary product dependency impacts economic growth through each of these. So, firstly, the first way in which primary product dependency impacts economic growth is through price volatility. So, demand and supply of primary products are very inelastic. And the reason for this is that they're hard to find, and also they have a set level of what we call derived demand. And this is where, if you're trying to produce something, if you're trying to produce a table, for example, you need a set amount of wood. And in order to produce that table and fulfill the order for the table, you need to buy a set amount of wood, even if the price of that wood rises. And therefore, when these two things come together, if we think about our supply and demand models, here's our S, here's our D. If we increase, I'll draw this out properly. If we think about our supply and demand model, if we have very inelastic demand and very inelastic supply, so there's our demand, there's our supply. If we change supply even ever so slightly, here's our Q1, here's our Q2, look at the jump in the price. It is enormous, P1 to P2. This jump here, let's call this alpha, the gap between the two, and the gap between these two, let's call this beta. Alpha is much greater than beta. So there's only a very small change in the quantity, but a huge change in the price. And that makes the price of our primary products very, very volatile. And as a result here, it affects the value of goods and services in the economy. Now, if you remember, GDP is the value of all goods and services produced in the economy. And therefore, if we're going to affect the value of it, but purely through price volatility here, then we're going to affect the level of growth that we get in the economy. That also has other knock-on consequences, this price volatility. The government doesn't know how much it's going to get in tax revenue, because if you're taxing the profits of firms, then firms don't know what their profits are likely to be because of this price volatility. But also, because firms don't know what their profits are likely to be, it's hard for them to know when to invest. And so therefore, G and the I component of AD generally are much lower than they otherwise might be if we didn't have such volatile prices here. Second way in which we're being primary product dependent affects economic growth is through limited diversification. So if we are primary product dependent, it means that we are focused on only producing primary products. And so therefore we're going to invest into primary products as they're making money, which limits investment into secondary industry. So if we are investing all of our money into our primary products, it then limits the investments into secondary industries and maybe even other primary products. As a result, it sort of takes money away from those other sectors and pumps it all into this one primary product or this few sets of primary products that we are producing. And as a result, it limits that diversification. So if we're limiting investment, we're then limiting growth in the secondary sector, which ultimately limits overall economic growth. So because we are primary product dependent, we are focused on that for our exports, we're focused on that for our GDP. We're not going to invest into other areas of the economy because we don't know if they're going to succeed or not. We know our primary product is working for us, so we're going to invest huge amounts of money into that, and therefore we don't tend to diversify away too much from it, particularly if you're a firm looking to make some profit. Third way in which primary product dependency can affect economic growth is through something called Dutch disease. Now, this is named after a case, I think in the 1960s or 70s, though someone can perhaps correct me in the comments, in which the Dutch discovered oil. And the problem with finding oil for the Dutch is that they started to sell a lot of oil. This increased their exchange rate, making all of their other exports uncompetitive. And so lots of them shut down. And they were uncompetitive with imports from around the world. And so as a result, they shut down. Now, the big problem was the Dutch ran out of oil. And so as a result of that, not only had they run out of oil, so they no longer had the oil industry, but they had scuppered their other industries because they just couldn't afford to compete when it came to exports. So therefore, if you are primary product dependent, your primary products push up your exchange rate. This therefore makes your exports, other exports, more uncompetitive. And the reason, of course, that it pushes up your exchange rate is because of demand for currency to buy your primary product. Makes your other exports more uncompetitive. So if you're manufacturing anything, as more and more people buy your primary products, that pushes up your exchange rate and makes your exports from all your other things less competitive against your international competition. And as a result of making your exports more uncompetitive, those other industries, those other sectors, don't grow, and this therefore limits economic growth. Or, of course, in the case of Holland, they might other sectors might even collapse. You never know. And so by being primary product dependent, because it pushes up your exchange rate, it means that if you're trying to develop a secondary industry, it's very difficult to do so because your exchange rate is usually higher than it needs to be to make those other exports more competitive. And as a result, your other sectors here don't grow. So for instance, anything you can make with copper. This is showing my naivety in that I don't know what exactly you make with copper, but let's say copper pipe, why not, right? If you're trying to produce copper pipe and then sell copper pipe around the world, the problem is that people are buying so much of your copper, it pushes up your exchange rate, and then your copper pipe is uncompetitive against, say, Chinese copper pipe, for example. And as a result, this limits the amount of economic growth that you're going to see in the economy. What you need to happen here is for your exchange rate to come back down to make your copper pipe much more attractive around the world. And finally, supply-side shocks such as natural disasters or sudden jumps in commodity prices massively affect your economic growth. So if your economy is dependent, as Zambia's is, on copper, then if there's a supply-side shock that suddenly shoots up the price of copper, for instance, like a natural disaster that might have happened, or we might see all of a sudden a country that was exporting a lot of copper suddenly decides that they're going to shut down entirely their trade and they're going to bump up massive tariffs and all the rest of it, and this is going to have a big shock on the supply side of things, then what we might see then is a big constraint on economic growth because the economy is so dependent. Because the economy is dependent on the commodity. Anything that changes its price, and I'm going to use delta here for change, anything that changes price is going to affect the growth of the economy. So supply side shock is either therefore going to increase GDP or decrease GDP, depending on whether it's a positive shock or a negative shock. And therefore, this kind of limits the economic growth you can achieve based on the price of one commodity. So this is a really big problem for a country, in that if the price of your good changes because of a supply side shock or natural disaster, sudden jump in the commodity price, all of a sudden, I don't know, copper's needed in new fangled electric vehicle batteries, and suddenly there's a massive jump in the price, that's going to mean that you're going to receive or achieve quite a significant amount of economic growth. But then if you have a flood in your country and you can't dig the copper out of the ground anymore, then there's going to be a massive shock to your economy and a massive drop in GDP as a result. Again, not a great place to be. It's going to really limit your economic growth. So now let's have a look at the flip side of the coin and have a look at development. So let's have a look at how being primary product dependent increases inequality in an economy. So generally speaking, these are jobs in these industries. These are low paid jobs. We are basically digging things out the ground. When it comes to primary products. And so therefore the returns to primary products can go to the owners of the firm. And because this labour is usually less skilled or unskilled or easy enough to train up, there's a plentiful supply of labour, and so therefore wages can be depressed as a result of plentiful supply of labour. And therefore this means that inequality of incomes is high. So because you can afford to pay people basically a pittance in order to work in the mines as the owner of the firm, and you receive all the returns for it, you then get a very, very high level of inequality within an economy. And that level of inequality causes problems with standards of living. You get a lot of people living in poor conditions, and in this case in Zambia in poverty, whilst you have the owners of the copper mines being very wealthy in comparison to them. And so therefore being primary product dependent increases inequality in your economy. It can also cause a lot of environmental damage, right? Because you are digging things out the ground, you're digging up the ground. And as a result, you're destroying habitats. Right? People like to live near nice places. And therefore, standards of living decrease. Now, what you'll start to notice here is we're doing these in 4 steps. So 4-step chain of reasoning here. We've got you are digging up the ground, which destroys habitats. People like living near habitats, and so therefore their standard of living is going to decrease when this happens. You also get depressed wages through low skilled work. And again, so we've said low skilled work has plentiful supply of labour. And so therefore, if you try to negotiate try to push up wages, workers will be replaced. And so therefore, if workers can just be replaced so easily, workers can't negotiate up higher wages. So therefore, as inflation rises, real wages, I should put here, sorry, not just wages, real wages are depressed. So because you're not a skilled worker, because there's a lot of other workers who could come in and take your place very easily, when you're primary product dependent, digging things out the ground or picking things off plants, or even sometimes just searching for things on the ground, then it's easy to replace you, and so therefore you can't really bid up, you can't really push up your wages. You can't say, look, you have to keep me on, you can't fire me because I'm so essential to the operation, because the owners of the firm will simply say, yes, we can. And therefore, as a result, wages are depressed, and this is affecting, of course, GNI per capita, likely low as a result. So really, there are some significant reasons why primary product dependency can constrain your economic growth. And those we've looked at here. You get that price volatility up here from these primary products because they're very, very inelastic in demand and supply. And therefore, that's going to affect the amount of growth that you're going to receive through potentially firms not knowing whether they can invest or not because they don't know whether they're going to be able to pay back loans. The government doesn't know how much tax revenue it's going to receive, so it doesn't know if it can implement supply side policy to grow the economy. You also get this limited diversification because people want to invest into the primary products. That's what's making money, and therefore they're not really wanting to risk going and producing something else when there's no necessarily guaranteed reward. You can also get Dutch disease. This is where your primary products push up the exchange rate, making all of your other exports uncompetitive as a result, and therefore your other sectors don't grow. That limits your economic growth, not outputting as much as you were before. And then finally, we've got these supply side shocks, where if you have a supply side shock like a natural disaster, big flood, or hurricane that destroys your mine, then you are going to be outputting immediately a lot less, and that's going to have a really big impact, a really big constraint on your economic growth. In terms of your economic development, we've got these increases in inequality because those that own the mines, those that own the land, end up receiving most of the benefits because you can push wages down, depress wages, because it's generally speaking low skilled work here. There's also environmental damage. People don't like living near that, so therefore your standard of living falls if you don't have those nice habitats to live near. And you get depressed wages through low skilled work as well. But there are a couple of times when actually primary product dependency is not necessarily that bad. And one of those is when the country has large natural endowments. So if you have a huge amount of a primary product, so if your primary product is not going to run out, then you can basically see through some of the bad times when prices are low. You can just increase the amount of it that you're exporting and make some more money. Whereas if you have a very small amount of this primary product, you can't really do that because you're going to run out very quick. So if your primary product's not going to run out, then when price is low, you can just simply export more and make more money. And therefore, as a result, you can kind of stabilize the economy and potentially stabilize growth as a result. So because you've got a lot of natural endowments, maybe you've got a huge amount of copper in Zambia, then if it's not going to run out, then if the price falls, just mine a bit more, sell a bit more, and hopefully wait it out until things get better, and then you can continue to export. This is something that a good example here is Saudi Arabia, which has just such a colossal amount of oil that being dependent on oil has not been a big problem for it, because when the price has fluctuated, it can just continue to sell oil or sell a bit more and try and make a little bit more money, and then eventually the price maybe rises back up again for whatever reason. Second reason why it can sometimes not be such a big problem is that your country can earn substantial export earnings. So this means that you've got lots of income in the form of X. If you then use that export money that you are producing in order to produce new goods and services, so if you use the money to develop other industries, if you use that to develop other industries, then you can grow your economy that way. And as a result, what you're going to find is that the economy starts to develop itself, and then you get these new industries that develop, and then you get sort of subsequent industries to support those industries, and so on and so forth. So effectively what you're doing is it's almost like taking on a part-time job where you're studying just to kind of get yourself going a little bit, and then you use the part-time job money to invest into education in order to get a degree, and then once you've got your degree, you go off and become a lawyer or a financier or whatever it might be. And what you're doing is as a country here, is you're using your primary products, you're using the stuff you dig out the ground in order to invest, in order to get yourself some money in the first place, to invest further into the economy. So you can use the money to develop other industries here, which means then you're going to output more, and therefore GDP goes up. So if ever a country is in a bit of a crisis in terms of how much money it has coming in, whether you're in a big budget deficit or whether there's simply not enough exports, you can always turn to primary products if you have them, of course. Turn to primary products and in the short run in order to get some more money in order that you can develop other industries. And then also, primary product dependency is not necessarily such a big problem if primary products constitute the only employment opportunities in rural areas. And this basically means that the alternative is poverty. And so here really what we're saying is that primary product dependency, PPD, is the only development opportunity. So in rural areas, in some places in particular, there just isn't industry operating. There's not a lot else in those areas. And so primary product dependency might be the only way to lift yourself out of poverty. So it might be that going around and collecting nuts and berries and insect resins and these kinds of things are the only ways in which that you are able to make money and keep a roof over your head, in which case being primary product dependent is your only option. And therefore it's not such a big problem because the alternative is a lot worse. And finally, if taxation and revenue provide the government with substantial income. So again, Saudi Arabia is a great example here, where if you are selling huge amounts of your primary products, you're able to get a decent price for them, and the government gets a lot of tax revenue, the government can invest either into the economy to grow it, or into, and again, we're thinking development here, healthcare and education, to develop the economy. Again, thinking HDI. So if you get a huge amount of money coming in from your primary products and the government gets substantial incomes, then the government can invest into supply side policies to try to grow the economy. It can invest into subsidies and skills and all those kinds of things. Or it can invest into healthcare and education here to develop the economy too. And so here, really, primary product dependency is a problem if you are primary product dependent in the long term. But in the short term, it's maybe not such a bad thing. So hopefully all those things are clear. If they're not, please do ask some questions down below in the comments. And in our next lesson, we're going to have a look at one of the other factors constraining Zambia's economic growth and development, and that is debt. I'll see you on that one.